Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott, president of Bay Area Skeptics. Welcome to the November SkepTalk. A few weeks ago, I saw a remarkable series of articles in Science magazine by a consortium of researchers discussing the effect of social media on the 2020 election. What was particularly interesting about this research was that they were able to have access to Facebook and Instagram subscribers, and tens of thousands of them, and with their permission, manipulate the information subscribers received, and then, in a pretest-potest, determine what changes, if any, had been made. It isn't often that real experiments are done with social media. It seemed like a topic Bay Area Skeptics members would find interesting. You probably remember the 2020 election. There was a lot of misinformation and many efforts to influence voters, and the question of how these activities might have affected the outcome of the election was a serious concern. It's November 2023, and next year we have another important election. So examining the role of social media, misinformation, and manipulation are critically important topics. So I requested one of those authors to be with us tonight to tell us about this research. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jennifer Pan. She is the Sir Robert Ho Tung Professor in the Department of Communications at Stanford University. Her bachelor's degree came from Princeton University and her master's and PhD from Harvard. Her research focuses on political communication, digital media, and authoritarian politics. She uses experimental and computational methods with large-scale datasets on political activity to answer questions about the role of digital media in authoritarian and democratic politics, including how political censorship, propaganda, and information manipulation work in the digital age, and how preferences and behaviors are shaped as a result. Join me in welcoming Jennifer Pan. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I'm so glad you are here. Can you tell me how this, there's just a whole bunch of you people in this consortium. I actually meant to count it up and I forgot to, but how did all you get together? You're from so many different institutions.
Yeah, so in the beginning, January or February of 2020, the two lead academics on the study, Josh Tucker, who's a professor at NYU, and Talia Stroud, professor at UT Austin, they got together with folks at Facebook to talk about, is there something we could do to study social media in the lead up to the 2020 election? And then they convened a large group of external academics, and I was one of those academics that they asked to join the study. I should mention that when we were first asked to join, they said, oh, it's going to be 10 months, maybe 1 to 2 hours per week. Now, hundreds of hours later, we're here.
Well, when you have that much data to analyze and to interpret, and write up in the first. I assume this is the first 4 of the papers. There are 3 in Science, by the way, and 1 in Nature, and more to come. I'm sure it's a very rich amount of data, and yeah, you won't be bored for a while.
Yep, that's right.
Well, why don't you tell us what you have to tell us? We're looking forward to hearing about this extremely interesting research. Take it away, Jen.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the political effects of social media, and this is evidence from the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. There are 4 papers that came out in the summer, and I'm going to be focused on 2 of them where I was the lead author. And on both those papers, I was co-lead author with Andrew Guest, who's at Princeton, Neil Malhotra, who's at Stanford as well, and then on the Facebook side or Meta side, Pablo Barbera. So for both of the papers I'll talk to you about, we were the co-lead authors. And here you'll see everyone else, both external academics and Meta folks who were involved in this study. So the motivation for why we wanted to do this is that over the past 8 years or so, there's been intensive concern about the role of social media on politics and in American politics. There have been a lot of claims of the effects that social media has had on political processes like participation, turnout, political attitudes and beliefs, as well as outcomes such as voting, vote choice. But we actually don't have that much good data to really support some of these claims. And so that's why we set out to do this set of studies and to ask this question: is social media responsible for the various political challenges we face? If so, how exactly is it responsible? I should say that, studying the effect of social media is difficult. This is a causal question. It's a question of, did social media cause XYZ? And answering causal questions well is always hard. But in addition, social media is so many different things. It's a bundle of different features across various platforms. There have been studies of social media deactivation. So researchers, this is Alcott et al. 2020, they pay people to stop using Facebook for a certain period of time, for a certain number of months, and then they measure what happens. So we know something about what happens if you stop using social media for a few months. But sometimes we want to unpack the mechanisms because there's many different things. So in particular, one of the aspects of social media that has drawn a lot of attention are algorithms. There are many different algorithms that are used on any social media platform. There's algorithms that recommend who you connect with. There are algorithms that recommend what you see on a feed if you're on a platform that has a feed. And many of the concerns, especially in the last few years around social media, has been around algorithms. They're complex, they're proprietary. We don't really know as consumers what's going on. And in addition, they're personalized. So for every person, the algorithm might be recommending something different based on what your preferences are, what you've engaged with, looked at in the past. And so for all these reasons, I think we've had, as a society, a lot of suspicion around algorithms. And algorithms have been associated with negative outcomes in politics, like spread of misinformation, hate speech, as well as on well-being. So how do we move forward? What we realized in trying to study algorithms is that we don't necessarily need to fully characterize exactly what's going on with an algorithm in order to find or in order to understand its effects. What we really need is to take that status quo algorithmic system with all its attributes and then modify it somehow. But as an external academic who's at a research institution, that's not feasible for me. So in order to do this study, we need collaboration with a platform who will change the algorithmic settings and then access to the data that results. So This study that this paper is a part of and that I'm a part of, the overall goal is to study Facebook and Instagram's impact on the 2020 US elections. And it's to do so through this collaboration between independent outside academics and researchers at Meta. And we wanted on the research side to address two main challenges. One is the substantive challenge of this need to study social media, especially in the context of American politics and elections. But then the second is not about the substantive question, but around the research process. So in the past, there have been many academics who have done research with platforms, whether it be Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. But typically, the platforms will impose limitations on what the researchers might be able to say, or they will need to give approval. And that the data that is produced as part of the study is not publicly accessible. So there's no replication possible. And so for this project, we tried to address not only the substantive question and challenge of understanding social media, but the process of doing research with a platform. How can that be made more transparent? And so what I'll talk to you about is the overall study design of this broad study. I'll focus on results from 2 experiments, and then I'll talk about takeaways. So in terms of the overall study design, I just mentioned the 2 challenges that we face in studying social media. These are the main aspects of the collaboration model that led to the output that I'm going to show you. So the academics selected the outcomes that we're interested in, and there are 4 outcomes: political knowledge, polarization, political participation, and attitudes toward democratic institutions and norms. Okay, so the academics selected the outcomes that we want to study. And then the academics proposed studies, which include experimental and non-experimental studies. And we worked with the Meta researchers to determine feasibility. Then we pre-registered all those proposed and feasible studies, which turned out to be 16 studies. So 4 have been published, so there's more in the pipeline. And for those of you who are not familiar with pre-registration, what this is a document before we run the experiment, before we look at any data, that says, how do we plan to do the experiment? How do we plan to analyze the data? So this pre-registration for our studies are available and are publicly available. You'll see the timestamps of when we registered it and what we said we would do. And so this is a way of holding ourselves accountable and being transparent about the research process. Another key point is that Meta did not provide any funding to the academic researchers, and Meta also committed publicly to not blocking publication. Then in terms of how the data was generated, so the external academics didn't have access to any sort of individual level data from overall users. Instead, the Meta researchers wrote code to get data from their side and then shared aggregated or anonymized data with the external academics. But the academics we were able to review the code that colleagues at Meta were writing. Another key feature, number 7 here, is that the academic team authors, so the lead authors, have the final, what we call final control rights. That means we get to determine what words go in the paper, in the final paper. All of this research has also obtained IRB approval, and any user level data that is used, so some studies do use this user level data, it's anonymized when it gets to us, but any user level data has been through informed consent. So a user of Facebook or Instagram had to have consented to sharing their data before we have access to the user level data. And really important, the last point, all the data associated with published papers are available on ICPSR at the University of Michigan so that anyone can come and replicate our results and build on them. Okay, so that's the collaboration model. As I mentioned, the 4 main outcomes which we selected are kind of this political knowledge, polarization, participation, and then attitudes and beliefs around democratic institutions and norms. There are 2 types of studies, experimental studies and observational studies. So experimental studies are ones where there's some sort of randomization to select a subset of users that receive a treatment and another random subset that are in the control group. So there was actually also a deactivation experiment where a random subset of users were asked to deactivate Facebook and Instagram for weeks leading up to the election. And then what I'll present to you are these what we call platform intervention experimental studies, where some aspect of Facebook and or Instagram was changed so that we can unpack the mechanisms underpinning the effects of social media on political outcomes. There are also observational studies. So one of the papers that was published, the third paper published in Science, is an observational study. So there's no randomization, there's no treatment control happening. It's looking at existing data and analyzing that data. As I mentioned, all participants so any individual level data that we're using comes from participants who are recruited and provided informed consent. So the recruitment happened on Facebook and Instagram. There are adult users who are monthly active users. They were recruited both in English and Spanish. And the participants who consented to responding to surveys as well as sharing their platform data. So the data that I'm going to share with you are primarily around survey responses. So there are several waves of survey. I'll show you in a bit how the timing worked that people responded to. Individual level Facebook and Instagram log data. So this is how many views do they have of certain types of content? How do they engage with content? So for these consenting users. And then we have additional data that we call this passive browser and app usage tracking data. So other than what we see on behavior on the platforms of Instagram and Facebook, if they consented to sharing browser and app tracking data, that means they installed something else on their phones so that we can see what else they were doing outside of Facebook and Instagram. As you'll see, people were actually consented separately for the primary data and the additional data. So you'll see the numbers of participants who consented for the additional data is much lower than the primary data. Okay, so getting into the results. So two experiments, what we call chronological feed experiment and the reshares experiment. These are two separate papers that came out in Science. The first is titled, "How do social media feed algorithms affect attitudes and behavior in an election campaign?" And the second is, "Reshares on social media amplify political news, but do not detectably affect beliefs or opinions." Okay, so question we're asking, how did feed ranking algorithms affect polarization, knowledge, and political participation in the US 2020 election? So feed ranking algorithms are the algorithms that curate your feed. If you go to Facebook or Instagram, it's what determines what you see first or second. Okay, so that's a feed ranking algorithm. And why are we studying algorithms? As I mentioned before, there are a lot of negative outcomes that we have attributed to algorithms. Things like polarization, spread of misinformation. But we really have very few studies of algorithms, studies that isolate the effects of algorithms. And as I mentioned, this is because that requires collaboration with a platform. So this is the experimental design. So we were randomly selecting a subset of consenting users to either the algorithmic feed, which is the control condition, or the chronological feed. So the algorithmic feed is the default experience for all users. So if you're in the algorithmic feed, you're in our control group, you're just seeing the content on your Facebook or Instagram feeds as you would, okay? Then our treatment is this chronological feed. So there you see all content in reverse chronological order. And just to be clear about what that is, let's say you're a Facebook user. You have friends. You maybe follow some groups and pages. So those are your connections that you've made a choice to make. Maybe you don't remember if you made that connection 10 years ago, but at some point you made a decision to friend someone or to follow a group or page. And then those groups and pages and users make posts sometimes, right? So that all the posts of all your connections, that's your inventory. And basically in chronological feed, whenever you log on, you just see the latest thing that whoever in your network posted. And then if you scroll down, then you'll see less recent things. Okay. We chose chronological feed as our treatment because it has been proposed as a solution to replace this algorithmic feed. And it is very different from the default algorithmic feed. So a lot of the concerns around algorithmic feed is that, one, it's optimizing for something. It's optimizing for user engagement and views. Reverse chronological feed is not optimizing for anything. Another concern about algorithms is that they are learning from your past behavior. So the rules are perhaps changing. Well, that's not the case with chronological feed. It's the same rule. And in contrast to algorithmic feed, we know what the rule is. It's just reverse chronological order. The most recent thing is what's at the top. And the last difference, as I've mentioned before, is that this type of default algorithmic experience is personalized. It's heterogeneous across users. And again, for chronological feed, that's not the case. Everyone has the same rule all the time. There's no change. So for us, this chronological feed is kind of as far in some ways as you can get to an algorithmic feed. Okay, and just for those of you out there, in terms of terminology, we recognize that reverse chronological order is also a type of algorithm, but we're using the terms algorithmic feed to refer to the default settings and chronological feed to refer to our treatment condition. We have a couple of hypotheses about what might happen when we switch people from the default algorithm to this chronological feed. One hypothesis is around political polarization. And there's been research that suggests that algorithms could lead to filter bubbles or some sort of partisan stereotyping. So to us, that means if we remove people from the algorithmic feed, it should decrease polarization. And we have two types of polarization here: issue polarization and affective polarization. So issue polarization is basically people's stances on issues. Like in the US, it'd be gun control, abortion, climate change. If you're on the left, you might have certain views on those topics. If you're on the right, you might have other views on those topics. That's issue polarization. Affective polarization is something else. It has nothing to do with your position on issues. It's about your feeling toward the other side. And one classic type of question that's asked is, if your child married someone of the opposite party, how would you feel? And depending on how you respond, you might have higher or lower levels of affective polarization. And so for both types of polarization, our hypothesis is that when you switch people out of the default algorithm, those things should decrease. Okay, our next hypothesis relates to knowledge. So we know that these algorithms are optimized for user engagement. And we think if people are on the platforms more, they might get more incidental exposure to news. If someone, in your network shares news, you weren't looking for it, but you encounter it. So we expect then when you switch people out of the algorithmic feed, knowledge will decrease. And then finally, we have participation. So again, here it's the idea that algorithms will increase engagement on the platform. And so when we move people out of the algorithmic feed, that might decrease this engagement and decrease political participation. We also, I should mention, you can see at the bottom here, research questions. We have a number of research questions that we didn't specify hypotheses around related to exposure to hateful information, uncivil information, untrustworthy content, etc. But here, what I want to show you is what data we're using to answer each hypothesis or test each hypothesis. So for first hypothesis around polarization, we're using survey data. For the second hypothesis around knowledge, again, that's survey data. So this is participants ability to answer questions about the election, and recall fake versus real events. That's your news knowledge. And then for participation, we're using survey measures, so self-reported turnout, self-reported active political activities, as well as platform measures, like on the platform, how much are they engaging with political content? How much are they clicking on political content, etc. Okay, so that's how we're going to measure the outcomes that we're interested in order to test our hypotheses. So the data, there are 23,000 consenting users in the treatment and control on Facebook, and 21,000 or so consenting users in treatment and control on Instagram. So that's the size of our sample. The treatment was active from the end of September to end of December 2020, and there were multiple waves of the survey. So there are 3 waves that happened before the election, and then 2 waves whose data we use after the election. One immediately after, so that's survey wave 4, and then one later on. I mentioned before, a secondary type of data we're using is this passive tracking data. And there the ends are much smaller. So for Facebook, it's about 3,800, and for Instagram, it's 3,100. So for this much smaller sample of people, they allowed us to see what else they were doing on their phones outside of Instagram and Facebook. Okay, so what we're interested in is, first, I'll start out by showing you how did moving to chronological feed affect people's experience on Facebook and Instagram. Second, how did it affect what people saw? And then the results based on for the hypotheses. Okay, what we find is that when people move to a chronological feed, it really decreases how much time they spend on the platform. It's about a 20% decline on Facebook and a smaller decline on Instagram. And this is not surprising, because we think that the algorithm, that the personalized feed ranking algorithm, the whole purpose is to get you to engage and stay on the platform, right? And so when we switch out of that to chronological feed, people stop spending time on the platform. What's more striking is that you also see a decline in engagement. Here I'm showing you likes, how often people like things on Facebook and Instagram, and how often people comment on the posts that they see. So this is conditional on exposure. So this is these actions as a proportion of exposure. You can see in the yellow is the algorithmic feed, and then in blue is the chronological feed. So people spend less time on these platforms, period, when they're in chronological feed. But even of the time they're on the platform, they're liking things less, and they're commenting less. So they're engaging less, even of the smaller time that they're on the platform. We see some evidence of substitution. So this is among that smaller N where we have the passive tracking. For Instagram, we see some increase in people. So if you get chronological feed on Instagram, some people are then going to TikTok and going to YouTube. If you were on chronological feed on Facebook, we see people going to Instagram, Reddit, and YouTube instead of chronological feed Facebook. So there's some evidence of substitution of other platforms. We also see increased exposure to content from pages and groups. So on the left panel, that's Facebook. On the right panel, this is Instagram. In the algorithmic feed, you see primarily content from your friends on Facebook. And on Instagram, it's people you follow. But in the chronological feed on Facebook, you see much less content from your friends. You see much more from pages and also more from groups. On Instagram, the change is not as dramatic, but you also do, but it is statistically significant. There's more content you see from people who are unconnected and more from follows and less from mutual follows. So mutual follows is you follow someone, they also follow you. So you can think of mutual follows potentially as a closer connection. So who you see content from, that mix changes in chronological feed. All right, now to kind of the content of what people see. One thing that we see is in chronological feed, people actually see more political content and political news. So the left panel is Facebook. The right panel is Instagram. The yellow is the algorithmic feed, the default condition, and then blue is the treatment chronological feed. So what you can see is that on Facebook, about 13.5% of users' feed, so this is the average proportion of feed content, is political content. But in chronological feed, that goes up to 15.5%. It also goes up on Instagram. In terms of political news, so this is politics and news, about 6% of feeds on average are political news. But in the chronological feed, that goes up to 8.7%. So that's a pretty big increase of political content. All right, these three things are around ideology. So proportion of feed from cross-cutting sources, proportion of feed from like-minded sources, and then proportion of feed from mixed moderate sources. I'll explain each of these. So we know from our surveys what is the ideology of the user. Meta also has data on where do these users spend their time, what are the sources, whether it's friends, pages, or groups, and they have a predicted ideology for those sources. And so cross-cutting sources would mean, let's say this respondent is on the right. How often, what proportion of their feed is content from sources on the left? That's cross-cutting. Like-minded means if you're on the right, how much content are you seeing from sources that are on the right? And then mixed moderate is sources that are somewhere in the middle. So what you can see here is that people do see more like-minded sources. So let's look at the yellow. That's the control group. 53.7% of the feed on average is like-minded sources. So it's definitely true that if you're on Facebook, you're seeing more content aligned with your political ideology. But it's not everything. It's a little bit more than half. But that goes down in the chronological feed. But also cross-cutting sources go down. So in the control condition, about 20.7% of the feed is cross-cutting. So for the average user who is consenting to our study, about a little over 20% of their feed has content from sources that are on the other side of the ideological spectrum. That goes down also to 18.7%. What goes up is the proportion of feed from moderate mixed sources. One thing I just want to note about these moderate mixed sources is that most of them are not political at all. So let's say you follow a local tea shop. That tea shop probably never posted any, let's assume that tea shop has never posted any political content before. They would end up in the moderate mixed sources. So that's what we see increasing from 22.6% to 30.9% in chronological feed. We don't have this data for Instagram because Instagram does not predict political ideology for accounts. Okay, now turning to some content that some people might consider more problematic. So this is the proportion of feed from untrustworthy sources. It's very low. It's on average only 2.6% of an average consenting user's feed contains content from an untrustworthy source. And it's even lower on Instagram, 1.3%. And so what's that untrustworthy source? It's a source. Again, it could be a person's account. It could be a page. It could be a group account which has spread content that is rated as false by a third-party fact checker some number of times in the past. So basically, if you keep posting things that are then labeled as false by a third-party fact checker, at some point after doing that multiple times, you'll get labeled as an untrustworthy source. And so that's what we're measuring here. But I think it's pretty important to note that the exposure in most people's feeds to untrustworthy sources is very, very low. But in chronological feed, that goes up. And it goes up quite a bit on Facebook. In chronological feed, instead of 2.6% of the time, it goes up to 4.4% of the feed comes from untrustworthy sources. The pattern is the opposite direction when we look at uncivil content. So uncivil content is also a very small proportion of people's feeds on Facebook and Instagram. 3.1% on Facebook, 1.6% on Instagram. That goes down to 1.8% on Facebook and stays basically the same, 1.6% on Instagram. Finally, we have this content that is slur words. It's very, very low proportion of feeds, and the rate goes down on Facebook in chronological feed and goes up on Instagram in chronological feed. So what we've seen so far is people spend a lot less time on Facebook and Instagram. Who they're seeing content from changes, how much they're engaging changes, and this mix of content changes quite a bit. They're seeing more political content, but less from cross-cutting and less from like-minded sources, more from mixed sources. There's this increase in content from untrustworthy sources, decrease from incivil sources. So a lot is happening. Now let's turn to the hypotheses. Well, when we look at the hypotheses, we find precisely estimated null effects across the board. And we have very large sample size, which was by design, so that we could be well powered to detect small effects. But we don't see anything. There's no change in polarization. There's no change in election knowledge, news knowledge. There's no change in self-reported participation or turnout when people are in chronological feed. The two exceptions that are not null effects are decrease in on-platform political engagement. So people stop engaging with political content on platform. We think that's just kind of deterministically related to the fact that people are just engaging less overall. And the second is an increase in the ideological extremity of clicks on political news. So you might be like, what's going on there? Because I told you in the previous slide that there's more content from mixed and moderate sources. But that's looking at content overall. If you just hone in on political news, in chronological feed, you actually see more political news from ideologically extreme sources. And what we're seeing is that people are clicking on those more. Okay, so there is this change in on-platform behavior. We looked at heterogeneous effect. You might wonder, does this vary by people's party ID, their digital literacy, their political level, political interest, age, gender, race? So we checked that and we find very little evidence that there's heterogeneity by these demographic characteristics and attitudinal characteristics. All right, so turning to the second study. The second study is going to focus on Facebook because it's focused on reshares. So reshares, I'll tell you more about the motivation, but just show you what this experiment is about. The control group, everything is the same. Nothing changes in their experience. And then the treatment here, people don't see any reshared content on their Facebook feeds. So usually if you're a Facebook user, you look on Facebook, you'll have friends who made posts. Those are original posts. But some of your friends may share, let's say, news. They're reposting posts from a news outlet. That would be reshared content. And what we're doing in this experiment is not showing users any of that reshared content. You just see original content. Nothing is reshared. And the reason we're doing that is because resharing is a mechanism through which content goes viral. It's not the only mechanism. Like Instagram doesn't really have reshares in the same way, neither does TikTok, and things still go viral. But on a platform like Twitter or X and Facebook, resharing, retweeting is a way in which things go viral. And there's been a lot of concern around virality and retweeting and resharing, because we know from observational studies that content that's false is more likely to be reshared and spread than content that is true. There's some sort of privilege for sensational content, novel content. But the past studies that show this kind of spread of false information is observational. And so we don't really know what is the causal effect of, let's say, removing reshares on attitudes and beliefs. And so that's why we designed the treatment in this way. So the hypothesis here, one is when we withhold reshared content, we think that will reduce polarization because reshares may promote encounters with cross-cutting sources, increasing this potential for kind of polarizing content. And the second hypothesis is that when we withhold reshared content, maybe that reduces accurate knowledge. And so there's two countervailing forces here. One is that reshares may increase exposure to misinformation, but we think reshares may also facilitate kind of incidental exposure to trustworthy information. And because we know misinformation is a really small fraction of overall content, we think the trustworthy information would win out. And so when you remove reshared content, that would reduce accurate knowledge. So those are our two hypotheses. What do we see happening when we put people into the no reshares condition? They also spend less time on the platform, and they also engage less, conditional on exposure. But the rates are much less extreme. That this change is much smaller than what you saw in the chronological feed experiment. So people didn't hate it as much as chronological feed. We also see an increase in exposure to content from groups and pages. And then finally, there's also a drop in the diversity of sources. So you're just more of the content that you see is coming from groups rather than friends, groups, and pages. Okay, what happens when you withhold reshared content? So the yellow numbers and bars here, you'll see will be the same as you saw previously because the control group is actually shared. But the blue here is the no reshare condition. And what happens here is there's now a decrease in exposure to political content and political news. So this is going the opposite direction as chronological feed. When you get rid of reshare content, you're getting rid of a lot of political content and political news. These are huge declines. But we see a similar pattern when it comes to ideology. Again, there's a decrease in cross-cutting and like-minded source content from those sources, and an increase in content from mixed and moderate sources. Untrustworthy information goes in the opposite way as chronological feed. It goes down when you get rid of reshared content. So that seems to lend some credence to the fact that maybe untrustworthy content is more likely to be shared. So when we get rid of the reshares, there's less untrustworthy information. But there's a slight increase in civil information in civil content when you get rid of the reshares. So that's what we found in terms of changes. So again, there's big changes that are happening to what you see. But effects, again, are precisely estimated nulls across the board. So there's no statistically significant changes on things like polarization. But there are a few things I want to highlight. So here, this is like a super complicated table. I'm like, can't believe science let us have this table. But we wanted to be transparent. So there's PATE and SATE. PATE is the population average treatment effect. SATE is the sample average treatment effect. And the difference between SATE and PATE is that we have consenting users. There's self-selection when you have informed consent. And so we need to recover the population of users by weighting. And that's how we get to the population average treatment effect. But as you'll see, we have some statistically significant effects when we look at the sample average treatment effect. And that's around news knowledge. We do see a decrease in news knowledge among consenting participants. So they're less able to accurately judge misinformation, and they also have lower trust in media. I should also note that we have the estimand, which is the PATE and SATE, population or sample average treatment effects. We have the ATE, which is the average treatment effect, the confidence interval, a p-value, and an adjusted p-value. So the adjusted p-value is because we're doing so many tests, we just by chance get significance. So we're adjusting that p-value to guard against significance that's by chance. Okay, so but for the sample, we do see this decline in news knowledge. And the one place where we again see a statistically significant population average treatment effect is in the partisan news clicks. So when you get rid of reshare content, you are less likely to click on news, political news that's from the ideological ends of the spectrum. All right. So what can we conclude or can't we conclude from this? So there are a lot of caveats. It was only 3 months, only in the US. This is during election cycle. There are only people consenting users. It's only one platform. So those are caveats. But I think what we can conclude is that we haven't found simple answers for complex problems of political polarization, spread of misinformation that we face as a society. Chronological feed seems like a great, easy solution. It's probably not going to get you the outcome that we want. And in any of the interventions that we saw, you could see those trade-offs, right? Maybe it decreases untrustworthy information, but then it increases in civil information. So when thinking about solutions to improving social media, I think what these studies show is that there's going to be trade-offs that need to be made. One thing I want to say that we cannot conclude is that we don't have the counterfactual of a world without social media. We've had social media for decades. And so we don't really answer in these experiments what effect social media had on the rise of political polarization or sectarianism in the US. Because we, in the study, can't recreate a world in which there's no social media. Okay. In terms of directions for future research, I think there's a lot of different avenues. And I think something really important, so from Gary King, who's a political scientist at Harvard, is that we really want these studies not to be a one-off, because there's a lot of unanswered questions and questions that are raised from these studies. So I'm going to stop there. I've shared a link to the replication data so others can build on and extend this research. Thanks so much. Look forward to the discussion.
Oh boy, you gave us so much. This is really fun. I've got notes all over the place here that I was trying to scribble down. It's really fascinating work, and as we were talking in the very beginning of this hour, there's a lot of rich data. You're going to be publishing a whole lot more on these data. We're just getting a glimpse, but it's hard to know where to begin. Chronological feed versus algorithms. I think a lot of us have thought, well, if we could only get rid of the algorithms, which is shaping our views on these issues of polarization or issues of misinformation, which are two interests that obviously, especially this misinformation that skeptics would have, that would solve all of our problems. But guess what? Doesn't seem to be the case. Am I getting that from your research?
Yeah, if you replace the algorithmic feed with chronological feed, you're going to get more misinformation.
That is really depressing. Is there
I think the thing to realize there is that we have an inventory. We've made decisions to connect with certain people, certain groups and pages. I don't know how long, I don't know if you're a Facebook user or others are Facebook users, how long you've been on Facebook. But I've had my Facebook account since 2005, and I do not know who I've, there's like things that I could have followed a long time ago. So you have an inventory, and that's where content is being sourced from when you're in chronological feed. And so even if you get rid of the algorithm, you're not escaping your network and the inventory that's going to exist there.
I know that you told us about two studies, and it's not necessarily fair to ask you to summarize the other two studies, but I do and I was planning on being a good girl and reading all four studies before our visit tonight, and it didn't happen. But there you have it. But one of the studies, I think it was Nyhan, the Nyhan et al. One, the Nature one.
Yeah. The like-minded demotion. So they
demoted
in the treatment group there. We actually also share a control group. In the treatment group there, they are making you see less content from like-minded sources. So, sources that are on the same side of the ideological spectrum. And what they find is that it works. I mean, it works in terms of reducing your exposure to like-minded sources. But when you look at people's click behavior, you're clicking more on cross-cutting. You're clicking more on like-minded sources. So even though your exposure goes down, your engagement is not changing. So there is some aspect that is user behavior in all of this.
I also recall, and I think it was from the Nihon study, but correct me swiftly, that it wasn't so much that you increase the polarization or you increase your views about a particular issue, so much as you just reinforced views that were already there. I mean, the views did not actually change with the treatments.
No,
Whether it was feeding people more information, I guess that was Nyan. But people, it's ideology uber alles, as it were. The attitudes that people brought into these issues seem to be very sticky.
yeah, I mean, you see that in all three of these studies, right? The polarization doesn't change at all. Chronological feed, knowledge doesn't change, attitudes toward democratic institutions doesn't change. The only one where there's some change is in the last study I just shared, the withholding reshares. You know less about what's going on in the world.
I mean, this all seems really depressing in a way, because, and I'm normally not a depressive kind of person, but it does seem like thus far there's really no solution to the problem. But at least we perhaps should not be blaming the algorithm as was our the knee-jerk reaction from most of us previously.
I mean, I think the thing is, I don't think these studies absolve social media platforms of responsibility in the sense that we do spend so much of our time on social media these days. That's how we are interacting with people. That's how we learn about things. And so that environment matters, right?
Yeah.
But as to whether social media caused the increase in political polarization in the United States today, I don't know that these studies can answer that question. And it doesn't seem to be the case where you change the algorithm, it's not going to decrease polarization. You get people the previous study that I mentioned, Alcott 2020, if you get people to stop using social media entirely, it doesn't change their polarization. So I think that's kind of empirical fact that we find, but I don't necessarily know that everything in these studies is depressing. Because if you look, for example, at the rate of misinformation, it's really low. Like we've been really focused on misinformation as a society in the last few years, but for the average person, very, very little of their feed is misinformation or content from an untrustworthy source. So I think that's actually really good news for most people.
That's actually encouraging.
It's not a huge.
It's not as much gloom and doom as we might fear.
Yep.
Although, misinformation can be extremely damaging. I mean, there's, we have seen examples, especially in the electoral context, of people being told, this is where your polling place is, and they show up and that's not where. I mean, there's really, it can be a very important issue, but it doesn't seem to be affecting people's core views, their values, and their beliefs about these issues.
Yeah. One thing I just also want to say is that we're looking at average effects.
That's true.
And there could be things happening on the tail ends of the distribution that we don't have. I mean, that we can't measure when we're looking at averages that could still be really consequential.
Well, I know that there are some people who have some questions. Let me just ask one quick question. I think I actually know the answer to it, but somebody may be curious. You chose Facebook and Instagram. Why didn't you take Twitter, which has, as social media goes, Twitter is considered to have quite a large effect as well.
They're much smaller in terms of number of users, but this is also coming out of so Facebook. There are researchers at Facebook who are really pushing for this type of work, this type of public, transparent work, and without them, this wouldn't have happened. So they did a lot of the work up front to kind of make sure that this happens, and so. Twitter never, maybe they approach other academics, but you need support from the platforms in order to do something like this.
That's true. That's true. Is there, and I guess I hadn't realized that Twitter was that much smaller, but when you look at the numbers,
much smaller, users.
And of course, lately having even less influence than it used to have. All right. We have some questions. Howard Winnett asks, How was subject comprehension of informed consent checked?
Yeah, so in the informed informed consent process, there were questions that were repeated um, to make sure that there was comprehension and the language. The reason why we did it in Spanish and English was so that there would be no language barrier for anyone to participate. And also, anyone who consented could withdraw their consent at any point. So they can either say, I want out of the study, and or I want my data taken, deleted out of the study. So there were actually many different points at which a person could withdraw, because they got a banner when they were on Facebook or Instagram asking if they'd be interested. Then they clicked, and then they were redirected to the survey vendor, which was like through a Qualtrics survey. And then they went through the survey, and then they had an opportunity to share their contact information. So there are many points in that process when they could exit and withdraw from the process. And that's actually the beginning. And subsequently, there's more points at which they could say, no, thank you.
Yeah, they're not. Priva Tramil asks, could another experiment after the Facebook feed, excuse me, could another experiment alter the Facebook feed some other way?
Absolutely. I think there's many ways that the default feed ranking algorithm could have been altered. There could have been smaller tweaks. So we wanted to start with the kind of most maximal change to see if we would see anything different. That's reverse. We thought that was reverse chronological. You could do something very different. For example, you still have a kind of a machine learning algorithm, but let's say it doesn't optimize for engagement, optimizes for something else. Or you get to wait what sources you see content from. So I think there's actually infinite different types of ways in which we can change and alter the algorithm. I would actually say both of these studies, so chronological feed, that's altering the algorithm. Like withholding reshares, that's actually another way of altering the algorithm, just getting rid of anything that's reshared, only original content. The like-minded emotion, the Nyhan et al., that's another way of altering the algorithm, because you're demoting things that are ideologically aligned sources. So I think there's really many more ways that we can alter the algorithm. And I think we've tried to set kind of, here's some really extreme ways as a starting point. What else could we do? I think is a great question.
Of course, if as an editorial comment, I guess, I can't imagine a social media company embracing any change that would lower participation. I mean,
Yes.
this is a business, but I actually, props to them for engaging in this study. Things could have turned out rather poorly. All right, the next question is from Raleigh McLemore. How confident can you be that responses, especially around sensitive subjects, are honest and are not shaped by the fact folks have others looking over their shoulders? That's kind of a general social science problem.
Yeah. A couple of things here. One is that there is platform data. So this is their clicks and views and time on platforms. That doesn't involve responding. Now, you could think, if people know that they're part of a study, would they behave differently? So there have been researchers doing this in much more sensitive settings around dating, around illegal substance use. And what they find is people really are not looking over their shoulders and changing their behavior and activity, especially on kind of mobile and other devices that we use constantly. I think it's a different question when it comes to surveys. But I think the good news there is that there has actually in recent years been a lot of research on preference falsification, social desirability bias, which shows that when people are answering surveys online, they tend to be quite honest because they can do it at a time of their choosing in a condition under their control. And so we don't actually find a lot of social desirability bias and kind of falsifying preferences when we do online surveys.
Good to know. All right. Can we have another question? David Walker asks, has anyone looked into whether there are certain people who, for whatever reason, are more affected than others?
Yeah, so this was what I was calling heterogeneous effects. So is there a difference, let's say, by age, by gender, by race, by level of political interest, by the amount of time they spend online, by their level of digital literacy? Do we see differing effects? Are some people in those subgroups more affected by others? And what we find is not really. The main outcomes don't change when we look at subgroups. Now, you might think maybe our subgroups weren't granular enough, maybe we weren't looking at the right subgroups, but I think that's why it's great that we're able to have replication data out there so that others who have a different idea of like, you guys didn't look at this subgroup, it should be looked at. That's something that can be done.
Yeah, I have to say that the requirement that you need to post your data is a good contribution to science, I think. Back in the Pleistocene, when I was actually doing scientific research, that was a dream. Of course, that was back when we were using cuneiform tablets for analysis. But all right, next question. Jay Diamond says, you had a few thousand subjects in the study, tens of thousands, and they were self-selected, as you indicated. How confident are you that your sample set is representative of the larger population?
The sample is not representative. So in the 100-page appendix, you can see that the consenting users who are in the study are better educated. They lean more liberal. They're younger. I think they're more female, and they're higher income than the user population. And so how we try to adjust for that is with this population average treatment effect, which is weighting. We're re-weighting the sample to try to make the sample look more like the population. But I think that is a constraint, and that's why we have that terrible table in our reshares paper, because we want to show there's no significant effects on news knowledge in the population when we do the weighting, but there is in the sample. And that could be because our sample is not representative of the population.
Although there's a lot of women on Facebook.
Yeah, it's not to say they're not important. I mean, our sample size itself is still very, very large. So I think they're, important in their own right as well.
This actually sounds like a similar question. Stepan Snyder asks, I wonder about experimental results if there were subgrouping done like different political leanings.
Yeah, so we did look by political ideology. And we don't find heterogeneous effects for liberal leaners, conservative leaners, conservatives. So we don't, that definitely is something that we were interested in seeing if there were differential effects by political ideology, but we didn't find, any differences by political ideology for our main outcomes.
Jenny Shelton asks, also, some of us skeptics click on stuff we definitely don't agree with because it's clickbait or it's cringy. This weights our algorithms. How true is social media activity?
I'm not sure what you mean by how true is social media activity, but it probably sorry.
Accurate? Perhaps that's what she means?
So one of the things with the algorithm is like we don't really know how it works. Actually, there's actually research on what we call folk theories of algorithms. Like people have really different conceptions. Some people will conceive it algorithm as a black box, like we just impossible to comprehend. Other people, and maybe this underlines that question, will think of algorithms as something they can curate. Others will feel like the algorithm is manipulating them, so they have no agency. So it is possible. I mean, the algorithms are learning based on what you do, but it's hard to know if you clicked on clickbait one time, is that going to really inform and change your feed in the future? or if it's, if it's one engagement out of many, whether that won't. I think that's a difficult question that we're not able to answer in this study, because we're taking the default algorithm as is. And so that's the bundle of all the personalized characteristics of the algorithm in our sample.
Got it. Stephen Snyder asks again, if you had this to do over, what would you like to have done differently?
I don't know that I would have done this this particular study differently, because I don't think any of us really knew what we would find across all of these outcomes, because there hadn't been a study before that kind of really focused and isolated the effects of the algorithm. I think there's lots of new ideas and unanswered questions that come out of this study. So I think there's a lot of follow-ups, and I went through that really quickly in my last slides, but doing this again in the future, doing this on a different platform, doing this across multiple platforms, not just two, doing this in other countries. I think there's so many more avenues that would be fruitful and important to pursue.
Yes, I like the idea of a cross-cultural approach. That sounds fascinating. All right, we have one last question. Has your work affected your use of social media?
So I would say that I'm not actually a heavy social media user. I'm on social media.
The shoemaker's children go barefoot, right?
Studier. Yeah. I think through this, actually, I would say through this work, I got to know Instagram better. And the Instagram and Facebook are very, very different platforms. The fact that we couldn't do the reshare experiment, right, on Instagram is because Instagram virality is totally different mechanism.
Yeah.
And so it was very interesting just recognizing how different features can lead to, in terms of, I think as a communication researcher, we call these affordances. So platforms are different features, and then people imagine how they can use those features. And that's extremely different between just these two. But in our social media ecosystem, we have so many other platforms, and they're also going to be very different. So I think it was great to learn more about Instagram through this study. But I think going forward, platforms like TikTok it's just in kind different than Facebook. It's not our, version 1, V1 social network. There's not really a social network in the same way. Studying those types of different platforms and the effects that they have, I think will be really important.
I imagine. And good luck in your continuing work. That is, if you want to spend this much time on that. Jen, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I think all of us learned a lot about. I think we were. There are some positive aspects of this and some depressing aspects of this, but the important thing is that we know a lot more now than we did before, and that's very important. So thanks so much for spending tonight with us. We Bay Area Skeptics thanks you very much.
Thanks
For the rest of you, join us on the second Thursday in December, which is December 12th, when our speaker will be a pop speaker known to many of you, a Skeptical Inquirer columnist, Dr. Craig Foster. He'll be discussing skepticism's time warp. Are we winning or losing? I'll see you then next month, same place, same station, 7:30. Yeah, same time zone, 7:30, December 12th. Thanks for coming tonight. Good night.